Hey there, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world we live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made those times. Today, we're continuing our series, The Empire, a 250-year American story, which is part of our look at the 250th birthday of the nation of America. We're currently in our Civil War era as we look at these episodes, and we'll be looking today at the Emancipation Proclamation in this podcast episode. If this is your first episode in this series, go ahead and feel free to jump back to the beginning to follow the full story that we started this past spring. This is episode 29 today, and we're running around 2 episodes a week at present. Also, be sure to go to the website, check out some of the other podcast series from the End of History. You can find things like the history of the Middle East to the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a lot of different Bible study podcasts like the story of David, Kings and Prophets. We go through 1st and 2nd Kings, tell the story, the historical story of what was going on there. You can also find a pretty timely one, the history of Iran and the next American war. That one was done several years ago, but you'll find it relevant to today as far as what all is going on in the world, part of the mission here, as far as helping believers make sense of the chaotic world we live in with intelligent, faith-based perspective of our times and the history that made those times. So there's a lot more there at the website. Be sure and go check it out. You can get that at jbshreve.com or theendofhistory.net.
This is the End of History.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So we've seen how the American Civil War was fought across thousands of battlefields, farms, rivers, towns, and beneath all of the smoke and blood lay this question that had haunted the United States since its founding. Would a nation dedicated to liberty continue to permit human slavery? And by the war's end, nearly 4 million enslaved people would be freed. Slavery would be abolished forever, and the meaning of America itself would be transformed. The story of emancipation, though, it's not a simple tale of inevitable progress. It's also a story that reveals a difficult truth. The Civil War was fundamentally about slavery, even while racism remained deeply rooted throughout both the North and the South. For generations after the war, some Southerners promoted the idea that the conflict had been fought over states' rights rather than slavery. To be honest, that's a myth that I was taught even growing up when I was in high school, at times even in college. This interpretation has really become a central element of the idea of the lost cause, that lost cause mythology. And we're going to take a look at that in one of the future episodes here. But the historical evidence leaves little doubt about the primary cause of secession and the Civil War. And the most revealing evidence comes from the seceding states themselves, as we've already seen in earlier episodes. When Southern states left the Union in 1860 and 61, they issued declarations explaining why they were doing this. Again and again, slavery appears at the center, the top of their arguments. The declarations of secession issued by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stevenson, his home state of Georgia, it complained that northern states were hostile to slavery. Mississippi, the state of Mississippi after secession, or with its declaration of secession, announced, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Texas similarly cited threats of slavery as a primary reason for leaving the Union. For the Confederacy, for its leaders, they saw a correction that needed to be enacted on the American Revolution and the nation's founding. Thomas Jefferson had written into the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Well, that was an abomination and not true in fact or in Bible as these guys saw it. The historian Alan Taylor, in his book, American Civil Wars, he writes about the Confederate Constitution as they seceded from the Union before the outbreak of war. He writes, "The delegates drafted and adopted a constitution that copied the U.S. Constitution with a few key changes to enhance state sovereignty, perpetuate slavery, and discourage partisan politics. The new Constitution banned protective tariffs and federal funding for internal improvements. It also limited the president to a single term, but stretched it to 6 years. The Constitution upheld slavery as a fundamental property right. Slavery mattered more than states' rights in the Confederacy, for the new Constitution barred any state from ever abolishing slavery, and no free state could join unless approved by 2/3 of both the House and the Senate. That author, that historian Taylor, he adds, Confederates claimed to have restored the original true republic allegedly created by the American Revolution. Perhaps the most famous or infamous statement came from the Confederacy's Vice President, Stephens himself, in March 1861. He delivered what became known as the Cornerstone Speech. He rejected the idea that slavery was merely incidental, and Stephens declared, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." So these kind of statements are difficult to reconcile with claims that the war was merely about abstract constitutional disputes. States' rights did matter, but largely because Southern leaders believed that, they believed that those rights existed to protect slavery. That's what it was about. And so the election of Abraham Lincoln triggered secession precisely because many slaveholders feared that slavery's expansion would be halted. Lincoln had repeatedly promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, but Southern leaders understood that stopping slavery's expansion threatened its long-term survival. And so they chose secession before Lincoln even took office. So slavery was not a side issue. It was the central issue around which all others evolved or revolved. Now, by the same token, another one of the great misunderstandings of history is the belief that Abraham Lincoln entered office as an abolitionist crusader determined to free all enslaved people immediately. The truth is, and as I've mentioned in earlier episodes, it's a lot more complicated than that. Lincoln, he didn't like slavery. He called it a moral, a social, a political wrong. But he was also a masterful politician who understood the limits of public opinion. His primary goal upon taking office in 1861 was simply to preserve the Union. In his first inaugural address, he actually reassured the South, this is a quote from his speech, he says, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." Many of us today, raised on the legend of Lincoln rather than the real story of Lincoln, we might find that statement shocking. But Lincoln believed the Constitution did not grant federal government authority to abolish slavery within existing states. And his position reflected both moral conviction and political reality. He opposed slavery's expansion into new territories because he believed that would place slavery on a path towards eventual extinction by doing that, by supporting that. But he was also not initially advocating immediate nationwide emancipation. Lincoln's views on race, they were also shaped a lot by the era in which he lived. Like many white Americans, including many opponents of slavery, he held assumptions about racial differences that modern Americans would reject today. All right? During parts of his career, he supported the colonization schemes that proposed resettling freed black Americans outside of the United States. The black people should be shipped back to Africa, as he saw it, or maybe to some country of South America, right? So while researching this part of the podcast series, I read several biographies of great and important figures of the period. My favorite among them, all these biographies, was written by David W. Blight, and it's Frederick Douglass, The Prophet of Freedom, or Prophet of Freedom. Honestly, this might be the best biography I've ever read. Douglass was an escaped slave, a black abolitionist, and one of the greatest figures of the 19th century, in my opinion. And the opening chapter of the biography, the writer tells the story of Frederick Douglass at the dedication of a monument to Abraham Lincoln's emancipation of the slaves in 1876. Now, the whole speech isn't like what I'm about to read here, but the directness, the boldness of this section is one of the reasons I like this guy, Frederick Douglass, so much. And it helps capture some of the truth about Abraham Lincoln before he fully evolved into his status as the deliverer of the slaves. This is a quote from part of the speech. Frederick Douglass says, "It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of the white man. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. Now, imagine coming to a ceremony to dedicate a monument to Abraham Lincoln 10 years after his death, a little over 10 years after his assassination, 10 years a little bit past the Emancipation Proclamation, and getting these words from the nation's most famous fighter for black freedom and civil rights. That's really impressive stuff. But Douglas wasn't just throwing out controversial clickbait, as we would call it today. He was speaking the truth. In his book, The Fiery Trial, Eric Foner, he describes a famous controversial encounter between Lincoln and a group of black abolitionists in the White House in August of 1862. Now, this is in the White House. He's already president. It's 1862, a year before Gettysburg. This is a quote from the book. What Lincoln said on August 14th to the black delegation made the meeting one of the most controversial moments of his career. You and we are different races, Lincoln told them. Because of white prejudice. Even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. It is better for us both, therefore, to be separated. Lincoln offered a powerful indictment of slavery. Your race are suffering, in my judgment, the greatest wrong inflicted on any people. But he refused to issue a similar condemnation of racism, although he also declined to associate himself with it. Blacks, he said, could never be placed on an equality with the white race. In the United States, where this is right or wrong, I need not discuss. Lincoln seemed to blame black presence for the Civil War. But for your race among us, there could not be a war. He offered removal as the remedy. He touted Central America as an area of fine harbors and rich coal mines where even a small band of colonists might succeed. It was an amazing side of Lincoln that we don't often hear about today, and one that certainly showed him as a product of his times. But as I've already said in this series, what I like about Abraham Lincoln was his willingness, his ability to change and grow. The tension between his moral opposition to slavery and the world around him, it soon became too great for him to bear. Once war began, Lincoln found himself squeezed from every direction. Radical abolitionists thought he moved too slowly. Conservative Unionists thought he moved too quickly. Border states loyal to the Union, especially Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, they still permitted slavery. If those states joined the Confederacy, the Union's strategic position might collapse. Lincoln famously remarked, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. This really constrained every decision he made once the war began. At the same time, enslaved people were forcing the issue. Thousands began fleeing plantations and crossing Union lines whenever federal troops approached. One of the earliest turning points occurred in 1861 when the Union general, Benjamin Butler, he encountered escaped slaves who had been used to build Confederate fortifications. Rather than returning them to their owners, General Butler declared them contraband of war. That's the famous line, contraband of war. His reasoning was simple. If enslaved people were being used to support the Confederate war effort, well, they could be confiscated just as weapons or supplies could be confiscated. Well, that policy spread rapidly. Suddenly, Union camps were filled with men, women, and children, black men, women, and children seeking their freedom. The war was beginning to transform itself, beginning to transform the nation itself. Historians increasingly emphasize that emancipation was not something simply handed down from Washington. Enslaved people played a decisive role in securing their own freedom. As Union armies advanced, slaves often knew more about troop movements than the generals did. They provided intelligence. They guided soldiers through unfamiliar terrain. They weakened Confederate agriculture by escaping plantations. Frederick Douglass, he later observed, he said, the slaves themselves were the first to seize upon and proclaim the great truth that the war for the Union was a war for freedom. Every escapee created pressure for Union action. Every slave who fled a plantation challenged the old order. Every refugee camp became evidence that the institution itself, the institution of slavery, it was collapsing. And by 1862, Lincoln increasingly recognized that the Union could not save itself while leaving slavery untouched. And the crucial turning point came during the summer of 1862. Not long after that very talk that he had with those guys in the White House that I quoted from earlier. Military victories had proven elusive. Casualties were mounting. European powers considered recognizing the Confederacy, and Lincoln concluded that striking slavery directly could weaken the South while also strengthening the Union cause. So he drafted an Emancipation Proclamation, and he presented it to his cabinet, his advisors. Well, the reaction's kind of mixed. Secretary of State William H. Seward, he supported the measure, but he worried about the timing. If it was announced immediately following all these military setbacks, it might appear desperate. So Secretary of State Seward, he advised, wait for a significant battlefield victory. Lincoln agreed. So he waited, and he waited. This was the time when George B. McClellan was in charge of the Army. So a Union victory seemed forever in coming as the president waited. That opportunity finally arrived after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. As we saw in an earlier episode, this battle was tactically inconclusive. It wasn't like McClellan had an overwhelming victory, even though that was what he believed it was. But at least the Confederates and Robert E. Lee had finally retreated from Maryland. And what the battle became significant for was not for the technical victory that McClellan had, but it was for its occasion that Lincoln used to proceed with the Emancipation Proclamation. 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The document announced that unless Confederate states returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, their slaves would be declared free. Now, the warning stunned the nation. Abolitionists celebrated. Conservatives were outraged. Many Northern Democrats denounced Lincoln as a tyrant, but he pressed forward. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation, a document that literally changed the course of American history, maybe even world history. It declared that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion are and henceforth shall be free. So this proclamation transformed the war's purpose. The Union would now fight not only to preserve the nation, but also to destroy slavery. It also authorized black men to serve in the armed forces. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers, approximately 20,000 black sailors would ultimately serve the Union cause. And their participation became one of the war's most powerful arguments for citizenship, for equality. If you're enjoying this podcast series on America's history, you're going to want to check out my book, Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics. If you've ever wondered how a person of faith should navigate today's chaotic political climate, this book lays it out. It's not about parties. It's not about taking sides. It's a biblically grounded book at how politics works and how believers can engage with it and sometimes even stand against it. Within the pages of this book, we explore everything from today's political moment, the history of the Christian right, and what meaningful biblical engagement can look like right now. The book is Politically Incorrect by me, J.B. Shreve. You can find the links at theendofhistory.net or head over to Amazon and add it to your cart this week. So, while the Emancipation Proclamation was revolutionary, it was also pretty limited. It didn't free every slave. It didn't apply to those loyal border states. It didn't apply to those areas already under Union control. So it didn't instantly end slavery. This apparent contradiction often confuses people. Lincoln used his authority as commander-in-chief during wartime. He claimed the power to seize property, supporting the rebellion. So the legal justification applied only to rebellious territory. Critics, they kind of mocked the proclamation for freeing slaves wherever Lincoln had little immediate power while leaving slavery untouched where he had a lot of power, where federal authority was strongest. But they underestimated the impact of this thing, of the Emancipation Proclamation. Wherever Union armies advanced, freedom followed. The proclamation turned every federal soldier into an agent of emancipation. And the Union Army effectively became a liberation army. Lincoln faced opposition not only from Confederates, but from a lot of Northerners. Some Union officers openly disliked emancipation. General George McClellan, he warned against turning the war into a struggle against slavery. Numerous soldiers had enlisted to save the Union, not to free slaves. One Indiana soldier complained in his diary and letters home as well, "If emancipation is to be the policy of this war, I do not care how quick the country goes to ruin." Others deserted. Some officers resisted black enlistment. Racial prejudice remained widespread throughout Northern society. A modern perspective today that I find frustrating is what I call the Disneyification of racism in America. A lot of people today, they get their perspectives of what racism is and the historical issues of racism from movies. And in the movies, the racists are easy to spot. They're hicks with a southern drawl, right? We oversimplify this issue, and we miss out on the historical realities of how widespread racism has been throughout the history of the country and throughout the country itself. Slavery may not have existed in the North at the time of the Civil War, but there was just as much racism there before and after the war. Just as much in the North as there was in the South. The famous New York City draft riots of 1863 exposed this reality in horrifying fashion. This is in the middle of the Civil War. White mobs attacked black residents. They burned homes. They murdered innocent people. At least 100 people died. And many historians believe the true number was a lot higher than that. Many black people were lynched in New York City streets in opposition to these this notice of a draft for the Union Army. The riots revealed a painful truth. Opposition to slavery did not necessarily mean support for racial equality. The existence of slavery in the South sometimes obscures the racism that existed elsewhere. Many northern states had enacted discriminatory laws. Many black Americans often couldn't vote in these states. They faced segregated schools. Employment opportunities were limited. Violence was common. Even Illinois, Lincoln's home state, had black laws restricting African American rights. In his book, The Impending Crisis, America Before the Civil War, the historian David M. Potter, he writes, the free Negroes of the northern states, of course, escaped chattel servitude, but he did not escape segregation or discrimination, and he enjoyed few civil rights. North of Maryland, free Negroes were disenfranchised among all the free states except the four upper New England. And no state before 1860 were they permitted to serve on juries. Everywhere they were either segregated in separate public schools or excluded from public schools altogether. Except in parts of Massachusetts after 1845, they were segregated in residence and in employment and occupied the bottom levels of income. And at least four states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Oregon, adopted laws to prohibit or discourage Negroes from coming within their borders. Think about that for a second. Restricted from even coming within their borders. Slavery is illegal in these states, but black people can't enter into the territory, into the state. Frederick Douglass, he understood this contradiction well. He observed, according to a quote, he says, though emancipation came, prejudice remained. Black Americans recognized that legal freedom would not automatically bring equality. The struggle would continue long after slavery ended. And of course, no group understood the significance of the proclamation better than black Americans themselves. In northern cities, churches held prayer services. Celebrations lasted throughout the night. Bells rang. Crowds sang hymns. Many wept openly. Frederick Douglass attended one such gathering in Boston. When news arrived that Lincoln had signed the proclamation, the crowd erupted with joy, and Douglass later remembered the moment as one of the greatest of his life. In the South, of course, reactions were more complex because communication was uneven. Some slaves learned of the emancipation immediately. Others heard rumors long before the Union troops arrived. Many plantations experienced growing unrest as enslaved people realized change was in fact coming. One former slave later recalled, "We felt like we was somebody." For countless families, the proclamation represented hope even before freedom could be enforced. So this proclamation, it opened military service to African Americans. This decision right there, it transformed both the war and the future of citizenship. Black regiments fought with extraordinary courage despite facing discrimination. They typically received lower pay. They served under white officers. If captured, they risked execution or re-enslavement. In fact, on April 12, 1864, Confederate forces under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest attacked Fort Pillow, a Union stronghold on the Mississippi River in Tennessee. This fort was defended by approximately 600 soldiers, nearly half of whom were black troops from the United States Colored Troops. After a fierce assault, Confederate troops overwhelmed the defenders. And what happened next really shocked the North, and it reverberated across the nation. Numerous eyewitnesses testified that many Union soldiers, particularly black soldiers, were shot down after they had surrendered or while attempting to flee. Reports describe wounded men being killed where they lay and others being hunted as they tried to escape to the river. One Union survivor recalled the cries of surrender were met with gunfire rather than mercy. Northern newspapers quickly labeled this event as a massacre, while Confederate defenders argued that the chaos of battle made it difficult to distinguish surrendering soldiers from those still resisting. Modern historians generally agree that a massacre occurred at this battle, at this fort, and that racial hatred, it really played a significant role in fueling the violence of Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Confederates who were fighting for him. This battle became a rallying cry for the Union. Black soldiers adopted the slogan, "Remember Fort Pillow," as both a warning and a vow that they would continue fighting despite the risks they face if captured. And free black slaves volunteered in enormous numbers. Among the most famous units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, you know about this one. Its assault on Fort Wagner in 1863 demonstrated remarkable bravery in the face of heavy casualties. These soldiers entered into the fight knowing they were being asked to prove something no white regiment ever had been asked to prove. They were among the first black soldiers officially raised in the North, and many understood that the future of black military service, perhaps the cause of emancipation itself, rested on their shoulders. The regiment was commanded by the young white officer Robert Gould Shaw, a 25-year-old abolitionist from a prominent Boston family. Shaw had come to respect and admire his men, rejecting the prejudice that surrounded them. He knew they faced dangers beyond enemy bullets. If captured, many of his soldiers could be returned to slavery or executed rather than treated as prisoners of war. And so on the evening of July 18, 1863, this is 2 weeks after Gettysburg, the 54th led the assault across a narrow strip of sand toward the Confederate bastion guarding Charleston Harbor. The setting sun faded into darkness as artillery shells burst overhead. Men stumbled through smoke and flying sand, but the regiment pressed forward. Witnesses remembered hearing black soldiers shouting, "Forward 54th," as they climbed the walls. Shaw fell dead into the parapet, but his men surged on around him. Sergeant William H. Carney seized the American flag when its bearer was shot and carried it through the storm of fire. Though the attack failed, the courage displayed at Fort Wagner, it really worked to silence a lot of the doubters. The blood shed there became powerful evidence that black Americans would fight, that they would die for the freedom of their people and the preservation of the Union. Another quote from Frederick Douglass, he said, "Once you let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship." The service of black soldiers helped make the argument impossible to ignore. One of the most remarkable aspects of Lincoln's presidency, to me, like I've said, is his willingness to evolve. He entered office determined primarily to preserve the Union, but by the end of the war, he increasingly spoke of slavery as the nation's central moral failure. His second inaugural address stands among the greatest speeches in American history. Rather than celebrating the looming Union victory that people could see now on the horizon, Lincoln reflected on slavery's role in causing the conflict. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. He went further. He suggested that the immense bloodshed might represent divine judgment upon a nation that had already tolerated slavery. Until, this is a quote, he says, "Until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword." This language reveals a president who had come to view emancipation not merely as military strategy, but as moral necessity. It's also a good example of what I mentioned in an earlier episode of how Lincoln came to see his role as president and the times he lived in far more from a vision of God's will rather than just politics by the end of all this fighting. Despite its importance, the Emancipation Proclamation could potentially be challenged once the war was over. It rested upon wartime powers. Future courts could overturn it, and Lincoln understood this danger. So a permanent solution required a constitutional change, and that result was the 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1865, ratified later that year. It declared neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Now, this amendment accomplished what the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, what it couldn't. It abolished slavery everywhere, not just in the South. No state could restore it. No court could reverse it. No future president could undo it. The institution that had existed since colonial times in America was now legally destroyed, legally dead in America. The proclamation remains one of the defining acts in American history because it changed the purpose of the war, the meaning of the nation. It announced that the United States could no longer claim to be a republic devoted to liberty, even while millions remained in chains. So the Civil War was definitely about slavery. The declarations of secession, the speeches of Confederate leaders, the actions of enslaved people, and Lincoln's own reflections, they all point to the same conclusion. States' rights were invoked largely because states believed these rights protected slavery. Remove slavery from the equation, and secession becomes difficult to explain. Lincoln didn't begin the war as the great emancipator of popular memory. He arrived there through experience, through necessity and reflection, as well as spiritual and moral growth. He listened to events. He learned from enslaved people who seized their own freedom. He endured criticism from every side. He listened to his own, he was sensitive to his own sense of conviction, moral conviction. And he eventually accepted the responsibility that history placed before him. And in doing so, Abraham Lincoln transformed the Civil War from a struggle over union into a struggle over freedom. The result wasn't merely the preservation of the United States, but its rebirth. The nation that emerged from Appomattox was imperfect and still deeply divided by race, but it was no longer a nation legally built upon human bondage. That achievement, one at terrible cost, remains one of the most consequential acts of political and moral courage in American history. Now, I mentioned Appomattox there. In our next episode, we're going to come to the end of the Civil War. We're going to come to Appomattox, the end of the fighting, and see where this all ends. That's coming next week in our next episode in the series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve with The End of History. Be sure to check us out, theendofhistory.net, jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent and faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made those times.